Welcome, welcome. We are just so excited to see this incredible global audience join us for our final D.school Future series, where we are going to have the opportunity to talk with UNESCO's future literacy leads. I am so excited to see the representation from around the world. We have Brazil, Cape Town, India, Vancouver Island, Missouri, Turkey, Argentina, San Francisco, Menlo Park, Netherlands, just to name a few. I see you, India. I see you all joining in for this wonderful final conversation. Austria in the house, I'm so thrilled. Thank you really for joining us. We couldn't be more delighted to have you all participate in this final learning conversation about futures thinking, and how we can all become futurists in our own community, moving from really having the future happen to us to embracing skills that will allow all of us to shape the future. My name is Lisa K. Solomon. I am a designer in residence at the Stanford D.school, and I'm thrilled to have you all here today to talk about the teachable and learnable skills that we can all embrace together. We started this future series in February as an experiment, as an opportunity to scale futures thinking, to make them more accessible, more adaptable, more known, more urgent, more possible for more people. I've been doing futures thinking for almost 20 years. I can't think of a more important time for us all to embrace this new way of seeing ourselves as active participants in shaping more just and equitable futures. Now, for those of you that have joined us for this monthly series, you know we've covered a lot of topics. We started with our dear friends, Dr. Lonnie Brooks and Ahmed Best, to talk about Afro-rhythms of liberation and Afro-rhythms from the future. We talked to our dear friend, Leah Zaidi, to talk about world building and how we can all imagine the pluralverse of possibilities. We spoke with Meredith Hutchinson, Aisha Bain from Resistance Communications to reclaim multiple histories in order to reimagine multiple futures. And we spoke with celebrated author and award-winning science fiction writer and journalist, Minister Faust, to talk about fantasy and the power of pro-social movements to shape new futures. I could not be more excited to continue and really finish this series with our friends from UNESCO. Thrilled to have Dr. Riel Miller, who leads UNESCO's Future Literacy, and Kwamou Eva Feukeu, an anticipation specialist, join us for this final conversation of futures literacy. What is it? Futures literacy as a capability, and how their work at UNESCO is spreading this to global leaders around the world. So please join me in welcoming Riel Miller and Eva Feukeu to this conversation. So Eva, Riel, please join me by opening up your video.
Sure. Thanks for having us.
Oh, we're so thrilled. So Eva, I have to say, the first time I met you, it was just you and me and 8,000 people from around the world that joined you for your December Global Literacy Summit that you had, which was just one of the most extraordinary gatherings. And I had the opportunity to see you interview world leaders and to talk about futures literacy and how it shows up in their life. And it was just extraordinary to have that opportunity to see you bring this capability to life. And Riel, I know this was a real brainchild of yours for a long time as a foresight expert who's been thinking about complexity and foresight for most of your career, and having many, many articles published in academic and media journals. I know we all share this passion for making future literacy more known and more accessible. So just thrilled to have you both here. And maybe that's the place for us to start. Let's talk about futures literacy. We talk about it like reading and math. It's common to us. We've spent a lot of time, but I think a lot of people still don't realize that it is in fact a literacy, something we can build and grow and practice over time across many levels. So maybe we'll start there.
Great, Lisa. Thank you so much. And it's indeed a pleasure to be here, and it's wonderful to be with such in the company of a multinational group, but also to follow up on the terrific colleagues you've had already on the series. The moment that we're living is indeed a very I'm loath to say this, but exceptional one. Most of the time, I'm quite loath to create the impression that the now is particularly special, because I think every moment for everybody is their moment, and their now is of course special. But I think we all understand the convergence of factors that have led to a particularly fertile moment in futures thinking, because with the pandemic, with Extinction Rebellion calling into question the way we think about the future, it pushes us to reconsider and to also then experiment with potentially disruptive and unfamiliar ways of thinking about the future. And futures literacy is really meant to be an enabler in that sense of understanding and appreciating the diversity of reasons and methods for thinking about the future. And I want to, draw attention in the context of talking about a universal skill, a capability that everyone can access, as you mentioned, to the component that is really related to our imagination, and to underscore the invitation that futures literacy gives to take our imagination seriously, and to not treat our imagination as if it's something that artists and silly people dabble, or designers dabble around in because they're ready to imagine things. It's one of the unfortunate consequences of a rather I think difficult way of dealing with uncertainty, which is to try and transform it into certainty. And that's a heritage we have from, let's say, empiricism and from determinism. Today, we need to really be able to overcome that. So this series and the work that you're doing to understand how people can learn to be more futures literate is, in my view, fundamental and exciting.
Well, I love that, Riel. There's lots to unpack there already, and I definitely want to dive into imagination as a skill that we need to take more seriously. It's certainly something that me and many of my colleagues at the D.school believe in. I love the opening of that Global Future Summit that you had, where there was a welcome from the UN Secretary General. And they talked about it, so powerfully, where he said, "Thank you for your focus on developing the world's ability to look ahead." And I just love that because it's so simple, right? Like, we can get caught up in a lot of these words, but thank you for developing the world's ability to look ahead. I just thought that was amazing. And I think that's part of our job, is to use language that we can all relate to and bring to our world. And as you said, this is an exceptional time. How do we make sure that we are thinking into and leading into it with these new skills and taking them more seriously?
One of the ways, and we'll move into this with Eva will present some of the case studies that we've been working on. But there's the disruptive component of this, which I made reference to, there's a hidden component to looking ahead. What if looking ahead really means not trying to know what's going to happen, but looking in a way at the present differently? And here, I really feel that we need to be relatively emphatic and in some senses contrarian in saying the way to look ahead today is not to try and impose our will on the future. This deeply rooted formulation of the role of humans on the planet, which is to implant their presence in ways that will be durable, so that we build imperial cities and great walls and immense pyramids and huge colosseums, and we saddle future generations with our brilliance and our assurance that we know best and that our values must prevail in the future. If they are to be safe, if they are to be sound, if they are to be wise, they must follow our example. This arrogance, this way of looking ahead is in fact a way of looking behind, because it's a way of reproducing, including oppression, including exploitation, that are the things that are familiar from the past, that we then entrench and reinforce. And even when they fail, we say, oh, no, we must save them by reforming and by making sure that they're adapted to continue forever. This way of looking ahead, which is actually in many ways a way of looking behind, is something that I think today we can not from the point of view of saying, oh, people didn't know or it was evil, but simply saying that we are learning, we're maturing as a species, that even though we're exceedingly young by most standards of geology and time, this species has the capacity to change the conditions of change, that we have the ability, because we can learn and we can pass that learning on, not in ways which say, I know best, or you must do as I do, but in ways which actually invite experience and invite learning by doing as a path to wisdom, and the wisdom that is not ours, meaning I don't know what the wisdom of future generations will be. That's their business. I have confidence and faith in them. And so I would say that the way we look ahead today is not to look behind the way we used to, but in fact to stop depending as in such a kind of uniform and narrow way with the notion of planning the future, imposing on the future, making ourselves feel secure because we think we've eliminated uncertainty, to doing the exact opposite, to embracing uncertainty, to embracing complexity, and understanding that creativity and difference, which go together, are something that can be nourished by the way we think about the future, not as a future to be imposed, but as a future that is open.
Well, Riel, certainly you're speaking our d.school language around embracing complexity and ambiguity and uncertainty, and not trying to impose a solution, but to really think of the range of possibilities with open curiosity and even a humility. And Eva, I want to bring in something that really struck me of an article that you wrote where you talked about futures literacy as a capacity. And where you say futures literacy is the capacity to be humble, the capacity to acknowledge past errors, present erratic wandering, and prospective errancy, the ability to learn from others, to share your ideas, and negotiate a collective cosmovision. I wonder, just inviting you into the conversation, if you could talk a little bit about your experience with futures literacy and how, you've arrived at this perspective around humility and openness and really a facilitative quality rather than, as Riel said, an imposing quality.
I feel like this element speaks to the implications of futures literacy itself. And maybe what I'd love to do is maybe to take you on a journey that I think was embraced by many people who are actually reaching out to futures literacy. So I don't know if you remember, but when we were first discussing this session, you wanted for this session to be about the capacity to decolonize as a project. Now, obviously, the capacity to decolonize as a project is a project that I love. It's basically about this assumption that we make that by becoming more futures literate, so by understanding why and how we anticipate, we can actually own our futures. And by doing so, we could actually develop a new sense of agency. And also one of the key elements around the capacity to colonize as a project is that those interrogations, both at a theoretical level and a practical level, are actually initiated from Africa. And there can be like many different reasons that are both ideological, political, everything that you want, as to why it's starting from Africa. But when I told you, no, I don't want for this session to be about the capacity to decolonize, I could not really understand why I was telling you that. And I realized some few weeks back that in fact, it was giving us the understanding or this idea that in fact, otherness and difference, this notion of marginality, is something that only exists in the global South. And obviously, we could say that through the development of our recent history, it's true that there were maybe greater agility that we've observed in the global South as to answer those questions. But this inability to actually notice phenomena of difference, phenomena of otherness, phenomena of marginality in our own context is for me something that speaks to the limitations that we have in our representation of the world. Now, in order for us to actually become more futures literate, you have a bunch of futurists, and obviously initiated by Riel, who's just there on the call, that have developed processes that we describe as being futures literacy laboratories, futures literacy labs, or FLLs for the shortened version. Those FLLs can have 3 to 5 different phases. It kind of depends, but in any case, they follow an experiential learning curve. The idea is to say that in order for people to learn, you need a provocation. And I know that the d.school will be familiar with this idea. And in order to do that, you need to also embrace the role of the group and the collective in order to actually feel that learning and also learn from the mistakes that are actually being made, because it's all about trial and error, right? Now, I want to walk you through 3 examples of labs that we've done that for me spoke to the limitation that we have as we are actually projecting ourselves into the future. So for the 3 phases that we have as part of the lab, we usually start with probable and preferred futures, which is something that is very conventional in many futures processes. Many futures exercises actually are about what do you believe the world is going to be like tomorrow, based on your sense of value or based on, you know, statistics that you've heard about or currents that you think would actually come to be. As we do that, we dive into a second phase where the facilitators, the futurists, actually propose a reframing scenario that is not probable, that is not preferable. The idea is just to actually bring you to another new terrain where you actually try to explore other ways, other reasons, other entry points to your futures. As part of the third phase, then, we have what we call new questions. So it's basically, we go back to the present and we want to understand what we've learned from the future. I know that sometimes we're actually all about saying we need to learn from the past, and actually had interesting conversations that I can tell you later around this idea of the tension between learning from the past and learning from the future, and how those two actually are intertwined in this idea that temporalities are actually something that is, you know, not linear. So the future is just as telling as the past because the past is being revisited in the future. But anyway, that was an aparté. Let us go back to this idea of new questions that emerge from telling yourself, well, you know, having explored different futures, maybe there's things about the present that I was not considering, or that maybe I was considering too much. So we have those 3 phases, just as a reminder: probable and preferred futures, reframe futures, and then third phase where we go back to the present and we ask ourselves new questions. You can add other phases, but we'll focus on those 3. Now, for the labs that I want to talk about, there was one on the future of living in the countryside that was done in France, in the northwestern part of France. The second one that was on the future of land inequalities, also in a Western European context. And a third one on the future of activism for a research center, actually in another part of Europe. And I'm explicitly using European examples once again to prove my point that I made earlier. In the future of life in the countryside, it was actually a lab that was requested by members of different SMEs, different small and medium enterprises in the countryside. And the issue was an issue of attractiveness. They wanted to understand how can they actually attract youth in the countryside because they had jobs and they don't know how to fill those vacancies. And so during this lab, when we talk about probable futures of life in the countryside, we talk about globalization, modernity, we talk about how the countryside can become the next, you know, city, basically. It's about saying that we have places of culture such as theaters, museums, you name it, that will actually be in the countryside. And so that's how the countryside is supposed to be more attractive than the city. It's actually because the countryside is now the new city. Now, the question I was asking myself as we're going through that first phase is, what led them not to see that cultures actually existed directly in the countryside? And some of you might say, well, it's because the current systems of value creation that we have means that, what the culture that is being produced in the countryside is not that relevant. And I would then say that, when we talk about culture, we can also talk about plantation cultures. And those are things that we know about agriculture. So in that sense, and it's part of the monetary systems that we have. So it's not enough to understand the limitations of their imageries, the limitation of the imagination. So the question is, what prevents us from seeing the potential, in that case, for example, culture, in places where we live, maybe places where we were even born? And in that sense, it showed to what extent just exploring futures was not going to be enough to just get them to that place where they can actually reappreciate the present and appreciate their identity. In the second example, it was actually around the future of land inequalities, where we're talking about, once again, homelessness, access to information, this divide that exists between, well, also the countryside and the city, but also intergenerational gap, this idea of marginality, those that get access to land, those who do not, so this idea of the have and the have-nots. And in that case, it was about, how can we go from the margins to the center? But then once again, we're feeling blocked by this idea of climate change, blocked by this idea that, okay, there's things about the world that are not okay. Now let's go back to those that usually solve the problem for us. That means either the state or technology. And many of the future scenarios that we usually develop were actually very much about this idea of like futures and future technology, or referring to the state. And we see that we have difficulties in initiating new ideas, new solutions that would speak to who we are as individuals and put us at the center in terms of agency. In a third example, it's around like futures of activism for a research center. And in that case, it was obviously a funny topic because, when you said that researchers can be activists, what are you talking about? You have people that are supposed to be wearing glasses and suddenly you believe that they're out there in the street with placards, And so what was interesting is that they're like, well, then it means that we have to fight power structures. And it was very difficult for them to see that research centers are also places where actually power can take place. I mean, basically, researchers are those that decide what matters in order to document or to archive sources of knowledge, items of knowledge. So they build the archives of the present, but it was very difficult for them to see that, even when we're putting them in a position of activists, people that are actually lobbying for something. And so the conclusion of that process was basically this idea that being conscious or aware is obviously good and it's useful, but it won't lead you to stop replicating systems because you're not even aware that you're producing systems. That's to begin with. But then even if you're aware that you're producing a system, you have not learned how to do anything differently. And so that speaks to the fact that tools are not going to be enough. You need to actually have something that's build not only your consciousness as part of a frame, which is the role of a tool, but you also need to have the ability to question the frame and to constantly question the frame. And in that sense, that's where we see that we need actually a capacity where we're not alone in doing so, obviously, but that allows us to embrace collective imagination. And by embracing collective imagination, we can embrace collective perception. And so what we've been actually trying to tap into is really this capability-based approach where we can actually develop a set of capacities that actually speak to the people.
So if you share all that, thank you for those examples, because I think they make them more concrete, like as if it's, we need a collective imagination, the ability to challenge our frame. And yet we know that so much of education is spent on teaching right answers and getting people to memorize and actually hardening and solidifying the exact skills we don't want for our future or won't serve our future well. I wonder if you could share just very concretely. We have a lot of educators, we have a lot of designers, we have a lot of crafters of better futures in this conversation. What are some concrete things that you've seen over your course of these different examples? Like, when did that switch happen where they go from, I almost think of it as like the black and white moment to like technicolor, like, wait, I have choice in how I ask this question. I can actually look at things in a different way. There's no set way of having to do that. I wonder if you could just share a few examples from your own experience.
I can give you an example actually from like 2 weeks ago. So in Togo, we're organizing this lab. I don't know if you know, well, in Western Africa, you know, we have a common currency that is called the CFA franc. Originally, it means the French colonies of Africa, but now they say that it means Francophone communities of Africa. Anyway, we want to change currency for reasons that probably will appear a bit obvious, but also economic reasons as to what the instrument is about. Now, as part of this huge colloquium that was organized, they wanted to say, yeah, we want to involve the youth. And so I was like, well, we can do a futures exercise to actually see what speaks to us, you know? And I told them, well, I don't want for us to be focused on the tool, so the currency, because maybe some people will not feel so relevant because here we'll be talking about something that is technical, that's supposed to be sophisticated. But can we actually engage in a conversation around the future of value? Because I wanted for them to see the difference between economic value and social values that we hold, and whether there is a disconnect, and if there's one, if there's a disconnect, then what does it mean about us as humans who want to develop, if I'm using current terms that are still in vogue. And as part of this lab, so it's a super interesting lab, and at the very end of the lab, so here I'm going back to the new question. So we had traveled to the future, we had like gone in all directions. And one of the elements that we realized was that we were evolving in a society of making and fixing. And another implication is also the fact that we're living in a society of circulating economy. I'll explain the two. The first one is about making and fixing, is realizing that, you know, we may be raw materials or manufactured goods. We're all about just like fixing stuff. So we won't just like throw them away. It's actually about giving them new life. And that's something that is very much related to the spiritual components of the societies that I'm talking about. And so in that context, if you realize that your economy is about fixing and making, then maybe your point towards development won't be about the industrialization, the way we've seen it in, you know, for the last 200-300 years in Europe, for example, or to a certain extent in other places in Asia. It's actually about thinking that maybe there's other ways for people to create value and to understand that we create value on a daily basis. So that was the first point. And then the second one around the circulating economy, it came from this idea that in fact, we're not so interested in accumulating stocks, but we much wanted to see that, you know, this amount of cash that is actually circulating. And this is not something that, you know, is new to the lab itself, in the sense that it's not about the future. Here, I'm very much talking about the present. We have, for example, elements in microfinance in many different countries, actually, where we came to realize that people were ready to pay higher interest rates on a daily basis, rather than actually save money and pay lower interest rates at the end of the month. And, you know, when people are asking this question, they're like, but no, it doesn't make sense. They could save a lot of money, you know, why it doesn't work that way? And in fact, we came to realize that money was always circulating. In that situation, they didn't want for them to save money and have like stocks that were there at home. They actually wanted to be in a situation where money was always there and moving from one hand to the next. You have somebody who's going to buy, like, I don't know, yam in the market. The person who received the money for the yam is actually going to use that money to actually give some pocket money for people to buy snacks. On the situation, then you have to pay the creditor in order to, because you've just commissioned in order to buy a car. And you see that within one day, money circulates. And so it's always interesting to see conversation around like the amount of poverty that we see on the continent, not to say that we don't have economic poverty, but it's interesting to see that what we're talking about in terms of money circulation, millions of dollars that are circulating on a daily basis, this is something that is happening today. Now, on the basis of that knowledge, what can we do if we want to actually build new economies? You need to actually be able to detect those phenomena. And the whole point of futures literacy that is actually used by the people themselves is actually about understanding how we function, how we truly function, who we are, in order to actually think about the future in a different length.
So Eva, I know Riel, you wanted to dive in, but I can't help for my design friends, and particularly those that have spent time recently at the D.school, where we're really highlighting design abilities. What you described there very much resonates with me as a design process, particularly around learning from others, right? People and context, around this practice of building and crafting intentionally. In this conversation, what I hear you saying, you're building and crafting intentionally the language that you are using, moving from, maybe the transactional to the more relational, and the importance of moving between abstract and concrete, making it real so it has resonance for people. Those are just three of the design practices that we try to bring out in our programs and our classes, to try to say, how do we all be able to think like this, to be able to, as you said earlier, tap into the collective imagination. Riel, I want to invite you to join back in and share your thoughts.
Yeah, so Lisa, thank you, and thank you, Eva, for unpacking this issue of, for designers, for educators. What's the concrete kind of examples and payoff? And I mean, we're in territory that's related to capabilities. So that's, it's the terrain of capabilities, and capabilities are obviously open, and we don't know what a capability will be used for good or for bad. And of course, good and bad change over time. But let me take something that I think is very critical and in some senses primordial, because it has to do with the way we think of ourselves as humans. And I don't think that that's something that's fixed, in my view. I think it's really something we learn over time. And here I want to talk about insecurity and security, anxiety. And we live in a time when there are a lot of people that are very anxious. And I think young people are often very anxious. And I think that this is something that's in part deeply troubling, which is that it's exacerbated by this expectation related to being able to control the future. And of course, and I don't want to, kind of make the idea here that we can walk away from knowing what we want to do and designing solutions in creative ways. But we've constructed a world around us that, of course, is very hard to escape. And it's one in which this expectation that we should control, we should succeed, we should resolve, we should solve, is all pervasive. And I just want us to kind of step back for a second and think what it would mean to be much more humble, but in a way that I think would really address this issue of anxiety, and in a fascinating way. A lot of the work that we've been doing, and I think a lot of work that a lot of futurists do, addresses initially two things, one of which Eva's touched on directly, which is people are waiting for an invitation to think about the future. And they're very gratified to be able to think about the future, in a way that's recognized, and in a way that's done in a shared way. And that creates a sort of almost a euphoria. And I think all of us who've done futures work have seen that. But I don't want to equate that with what I'm talking about, because I'm talking about something I think that is different. It's not just evoking different possible futures, or being all of a sudden impressed by the menu of choices that somehow you've dreamt up. it's really about taking a different relationship to them. And I want to say that I think, everybody can understand the difference here. Planning is not improvisation, and improvisation is not planning. They're not the same thing. And I want to go a bit further to say that we've been almost, and it's kind of incredible, in fact, that we've gone this far. But the fundamental alienation of our species in most of our communities from the marvelous and amazing creativity of our universe has led to a situation where we are very distant from meaning, where meaning is invested in things that are reputational, durable, that impose on the future because they're a statue, they're a legacy that is heavy. And I want to turn it around and say, most of the information in this universe, most of the information is ephemeral. Most of it is right now, right happening at this moment, how we feel, what it makes us sense, what we're sharing together. And the way we've used the future primarily in these planning societies actually negates all that and says the only thing that matters is the thing that will have some sort of impact. And my meaning, who I am, is related to, can I make a difference? And I have the moral responsibility to take care of future generations. Hey, would you like previous generations to have been able to impose their values on us today? It would certainly, I think, not sit too well with most of us here to say our grandparents' sense of, let's just say, sexuality and sexual relationships should be imposed from the Victorian era. No, not at all. And so this idea of our relationship to the future is deeply transformative of our very conception of who we are. And it means an abandonment. I mean, and by this, I mean really an abandonment of one of the main pillars with which we create our identity, and which we try to plan and design the future by being prescient in one way or another. And so I don't know, maybe I'm belaboring a point that everybody understands, but I feel that it's still very relevant and difficult. At least in my practice, I see how difficult it is for people to make that shift. Even linguistically, our language is anchored in this idea of the value of planning, imposing our ways, our thinking on the future, and we have a very, very hard time escaping it.
Riel, I love that. And I love your passion for that, because it's important, because it's so steeped, it's like that. I forget the water. We don't even know we're swimming in water. I mean, all those proverbs about like not even being aware of our surroundings. I want to ask a simple question. We promised that this would be a little interactive as much as we could in this format with the fabulous global audience that we have. That builds off your provocation, which is, how can we invite more imagination into our conversations? I mean, if imagination allows us to break free in part from the planning, right, which is quite rigid, and allows us to enter into new frames and new provocations, I would love to just open it up and share in the chat. How have you invited imagination, new images of the future, new ways of escaping what Riel is sharing around our constraints, whether we even acknowledge them or not. So want to just encourage our panelists to join. I know Frankie has already created and added and shared a new resource, but this is an opportunity for us to exchange ideas, because Riel, as you say, we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do and it starts young. And so this actually is a great opportunity for me to invite my very dear colleague, Laura McBain, to join the conversation as well. Laura is the co-director of the K-12 lab at the D.school, and she basically spends every waking moment trying to think about how can we liberate our educational systems to become more equitable, more just. How can we help educators see themselves as futurists? Because let's face it, the earlier we get in the pipe of helping our youngest learners and leaders embrace some of the things that you're sharing with us, I think the more robust and resilient and sustainable our future will be. So Laura, thank you for joining our conversation. And I know you've been in conversations with Eva and Riel, and I wonder if you could just share a little bit about your passion for this, and even, as an educator, have the opportunity to ask Riel and Eva some questions about how we can bring this to more people.
And that's the question, I think. And thank you, Lisa, for bringing me into the conversation. And I'm so honored to be with Eva and Riel on this call together, because we've been in a lot of conversations about what this really looks like in practice. And I really love, Riel, the last question is how we build imagination as a practice into our worlds, whether it's in K-12 or in any other domain. And I think it's not surprising to you all is that, in K-12, we're really creative, we're agile. And there has been an inflection moment we're sitting in, particularly in K-12 and education and higher ed as well, particularly around this year, right? About how we actually have to respond to this moment, this inflection moment. And so one of the things that we're continuing to struggle with, and I think, Eva, you really put it together pretty nicely, is that we recreate the same things, even when we're trying to imagine a new schooling system, a new learning ecosystem, a new classroom. We replicate the same systems and structures that were in our past, right? That are continuing to replicate oppression and inequitable systems, et cetera. And so, one of the things that we are spending some time on, and I'm curious to you all about the concept of world building, this idea of traveling to the future to imagine a new world. How does a strategy like world building, and Eva and Riel can explain it more discreetly, but how does that type of experience or that strategy or that practice help us get to what you're all talking about, which is imagining, right? Stepping into the future without the present constraints so that we can see potentially what is possible. Not surprising is that even when we think about a day in the life in the future, which we've done a few times with educators, we still there's a teacher, they're sitting in a classroom and the teacher's telling the young person the same construct is replicated. And so I am kind of curious about what are the best ways to bring in imagination, into how we think about planning. Because I think you're right, we plan and we're really good at planning and replicating the same thing, but really letting go of the plan and really thinking about what are the tactics and what are the strategies to really let our imagination fly, not so that there's some whimsical idea we can't ever implement, right? But where we can see the seeds of a possibility. And so, that's one of our biggest questions, I will say, in K-12 is really how do we embrace and nurture this imagination state so that we can get to the futures that we all are really thinking that we're hopeful for.
I'll take a first shot at it. Wonderful, of course, to explore this. And I'm going to come back to improvisation, which my experience with improvisation was not with music, but with dance, actually. And improvisational dance requires what all improvisation requires, which is practice and repetition and drills and strengths and familiarity and alertness. So you'll see the murmuration behind me with the starlings that are highly fluid and are continuously improvising. But it's not because they actually did drills in the case of starlings. It's because they have this unbelievable agility that's built in. And over time, there was no lead starling, no planner who said to them, "We must plan a murmuration." They, through the process of complex emergence, ended up doing this amazing thing called a murmuration. And I want to really draw attention to that. And I think you're right about children. They're experimentalists by nature, because you need to experiment in order to check out how your body works. What happens when I move? And I need to repeat it so that I can get confident. And that's the point that I was going to make, is that experiential learning by doing, allows us to become wise. Basically, it's a maturity model. And it's not a push model where I know best and I'm going to tell you. It's the creation of safe spaces, but challenging spaces where you can fall and where you can fail, and where failure becomes something that you can savor, and where imperfection and not succeeding are something that you realize are always part of you, and you can live with it. And so improvisation is not always getting the notes right. Improvisation is not always moving in the way that you're patting your head with your body, because your body doesn't correspond exactly with what your head is doing. In the same way, an instrument, when you're playing in jazz, you can't always express exactly what you want in your mind. And so this imperfection, this continual ability to appreciate experience is really at the root here. And I'll finish with this point, is that the capacity to identify, make sense of difference, things that don't repeat. So it's be improvisational. That capacity really is deeply inhibited by the desire to live with certainty, to be in a context that is certain. And that's where this relationship between confidence and practice come into play. And so everybody here, I'm sure on this call, understands about creativity. The creativity requires constraints. Creativity requires difference, because if it's just monotone and repetitive, there is no creativity. So what can we do that really flips on its head so much of what informs the human attitude towards change? Change is the only constant. And yet we're completely kind of paralyzed, like deer in the headlights when it comes to change. And so I guess, I don't need to tell a K-12 gang that, that moment when the teacher starts to tell you what the answers are, that's the moment when we kill it. And to get beyond that is really something that involves the parents, because the parents are the ones who are scared for their children. And we pass this on generation by generation. And the folks who are suffering, and I know them, personally, the university students, the high school students who feel traumatized by the pandemic. That's that's the fault of the system and of the older generations who have created this instead of saying, whoa, unbelievable. Finally, we're going to be able to go virtual, and globalization is going to be turned on its head so that we can do what we're doing today, because we could have done that 15 years ago and we didn't. Now we can. And this is a wild opening. We're into the roaring 20s, folks. And instead we're going, oh dear, how are we going to get back to normal? How are we going to reconstruct? How are we going to know what the future is going to be so we can give our children a sense of certainty? And they inherit that anxiety. That inhibits their confidence, then they can't become creative. So, we really need to be, I think, conscious of the extent to which we have to break, disrupt, subvert the existing ways of thinking.
And what better time than now, Riel, to really think about that? As certainly parts of the world, not everyone are emerging. We're seeing an alarming return to systems that didn't serve us well. And so to really use this moment and also acknowledge, as someone that thinks deeply about the future, I worry that we don't fully understand the implications of the future of this pandemic from the realities that you're talking about around the impact of mental health, around the messages of care that we've given our kids that have actually created anxiety and an more isolated way of seeing it. So I think we all need to be aware of that at this moment and have a responsibility to be asking the more generative questions, to be really leaning into imagination. Riel, I want to actually, this open to both of you, because Eva, as I mentioned in our opening, I was so taken by you talking with world leaders about their image of the future at this conference, this summit. It was just so extraordinary. So we talked about, and you can see in the chat, a lot of people are commenting on how beautifully human imagination is and seen in young children. And then they enter formal education and somehow we send messages that that's not warranted or needed or respected. So I want to talk about the leadership angle of this and why it's so important to get leaders comfortable with imagination. I don't know about you, but it's very rare that I have talked to a leader in a large organization who says, we have a really challenging issue. Let's get imaginative. Let's get playful. Let's bring in artists, as someone suggested in the chat. So here you are fostering a global community of leaders that are leaning into this. What's your secret sauce? How do you get them to step away from the planning and the spreadsheets and lean into the playful imagination? We're listening. So Eva, I'll start with you. We just heard from Riel. And you can even share, did anything surprise you in your interviews with these world leaders, about their willingness to talk about imagination, their image of the future?
That's an interesting question. Well, obviously it made me laugh at first, but As you were asking that question, I was also thinking back to what you had just mentioned in your conversation. And I think what resonated the most as I was talking to what you would call those word leaders, and I guess, yeah, that's actually the term to be used, is you remember the first question that we're asking them, which was about having them share a memory of the future. So to actually go back to the past to tell us moments where they thought that the future mattered in a particular way. And I think what all of their answers had in common was actually the security that the future could hold. This idea that the future could be something that was it's not even about certainty of the future, but it's really about this idea that there's beauty in continuity and something that is constant. And I realized as we were organizing a lab around disaster risk reduction, where we actually ask ourselves, why do we want to prevent risk? Why do we want to prevent disaster? And once again, we went back to this idea of safety. And what I was hearing from those word leaders was actually this idea that we're trapped by one single question that we ask, which is how to be safe. And if you ask the question, how to be safe, I mean, well, if you ask me that question, I don't know what would be your answer, but it's obviously, at least if I stay at home with my book, I know I'm safe. I have everything that I need. I have a computer. I can have like family involved. We can go for calls, but when the question that you ask about your future is actually about safety, you feel trapped. And we understand that in fact, the summit was taking place right, during the pandemic. So we're in situations also, that's the reason people actually accepted to be in front of their computer for 5 days straight. They really needed to not be anywhere else. But obviously in that situation, they were still speaking from this place of security, of safety, because that was the only question that was allowed. And I think the way we've actually seen how to develop this network was actually about exploring new ways for the future to be relevant, not necessarily to answer just one question. But in order to hear more than one question, you need to have more than one person on the table as well. And so this idea of participatory futures is actually something that we've been trying to embrace, which means that as UNESCO, obviously, we do have this advantage of being an intergovernmental organization, so we can reach out to different member states. We have over 193 member states, but we can also work with banks, which is something that we've been doing quite often. We'll work with universities and schools, which are our UNESCO chairs. We have, by the end of this year, we'll have 33 UNESCO chairs, who all think that the futures matter, but for different reasons. Some believe that it's in order to fight cultural stereotypes. Others believe that it's important just so that we can become more ethical, more responsible around the decisions that we make. But in any case, all of them believe that the future matters from their perspective, and they bring something new to the conversation. And because we use something that does not exist, which is the future, everybody can be relevant in that conversation. And I think this premise that comes from both the subject matter, so futures, and the specific structure of UNESCO as an organization allows us to actually push that conversation in another direction around actually who's entitled to speak about futures, who's legitimate to speak about futures, and what can we learn from those that are actually talking.
Eva, I love that you ended that answer with more questions. That feels very, very appropriate. So Riel, maybe you could sort of share some final words as we end up our time together about, thinking about futures literacy as a systems play, starting with leaders through structures and maybe reaching our youngest learners. And you have been studying and sharing the need and urgency for futures for such a long time. I can't think of a time that it feels more urgent to do so. And I'm so personally grateful for the work you're doing around launching the labs around the world, around really finding bridges between, as you said earlier, Eva, academics and researchers, and really instilling this theme throughout our conversation of agency, that we all have the ability to question in new ways. So I just wonder if you could close us out with some, of your thoughts and hopes for the future and how we can all continue to pursue our practices.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you to Eva and Laura, and the questions from the chat. Let me kind of cast this back a little bit. And so I don't know how many of you studied or recall. There was something called the Theses on Feuerbach that Karl Marx wrote, and the 11th was, not just observing the world but changing it. That this is the responsibility of philosophers, not just to observe the world but to change it. Which of course was a call to activism, which became a rallying cry for militants and political action in the 19th and 20th century, and today as well. I guess what occurred to me as somebody who grew up, and when I was again an adolescent in Washington, we were protesting against the Vietnam War, and there was the sense that the atomic bomb was very, very dangerous at the time. I can remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, etc. So existential risk was not just climate change, but there was an existential risk that was taken as very seriously, something that could end life on Earth. And I look to the state, the point that Eva was raising about where we look to our solutions, where we're trying to fix the problem. And I looked at the debate between those who are arguing for revolution versus those who are arguing for reform. And basically after about 35, 40 years where I took advantage of the opportunities that I had to visit and be in part of the state, part of the OECD, part of civil society, trade unions, etc. I was pretty convinced we couldn't get to where I think we wanted to go from the point of departure that looks at change in terms of reform or revolution. And so what I'm saying here is that changes in the conditions of change is where it's at. That paradigmatic change is crucial. But in order to walk the talk of paradigmatic change that's not revolutionary or reform oriented, it's necessary to do something that's very difficult, which is to let go and to not think that I'm going to cause it or you're going to cause it or that somebody will know, but rather to think continuously in transitional terms. Maybe this will be important, maybe it won't. Maybe there'll be unintended consequences, maybe there won't. And to not, in some senses, try to take responsibility for the future, but to turn it around and do something which is almost, an obvious critique and flipping on its head of modernism, but and the experiences that we have from the 20th century, which is the means are the ends. What you do, to take a whole earth catalog, you are what you eat. And the notion of legacy here transforms pretty much entirely into being as light as possible, to embracing birth and death, therefore not fetishizing immortality and not trying to impose on future generations. I just want to point out that kind of approach presumably would have stopped us from splitting the atom for energy to create a huge amount of radioactive waste that future generations have to deal with, and to disrespect future generations by pouring gigatons of concrete. 1,000 years from now, our world, us, will be remembered because we burdened the world with immense amounts of concrete. We are not light, we're monumentalist, we're arrogant. And so this departure from trying to construct the future, which leads to path dependency and which atrophies our imagination, is really, for me, the crucial message.
Well, Riel, I can't think of a better way to end this conversation and this series, which is to pull in Eva's language, provocations for the future. For us to say we don't have to accept where we've been, but we have an opportunity to reframe where we want to go in order to inform better decisions today. And really, that is, I think, the heart of it. How can we make better decisions today, not only for the future that we know is coming in our youngest, but for the legacy and the learners that will come after them. So I want to end by thanking everyone for joining us. You will, as you always do, get more resources following this call, many of which point back to Riel and Eva's brilliant work. We hope the conversation continues. We are thrilled for all of your participation, and thank you so much. We have a lot of work to do, and we have to take moments to celebrate when we can come together and do this kind of have this kind of opportunity to share it with more people. So Riel, Eva, thank you so much. Laura, thank you so much. And thank you to all of my D-School colleagues that helped make this series happen. And the good news is that they're all recorded. So we already have them live. I'll put them in the chat now. And this one we will add to that field note as well. So thank you, friends, and thank you all for joining us.